Okay, let's unpack this. Imagine a political figure who's, well, been around for what feels like forever. Someone who just keeps popping up right at the center of things, even after they've supposedly stepped back.
Like a boomerang.
Yeah, exactly. Or, as some of the material we looked at kind of puts it, like a really stubborn piece of durian, clinging on whether you like the taste or not.
It's that sheer persistence, isn't it, that
Yeah.
really jumps out from these sources. And they argue it's not just like one person's ambition. It says something bigger about the whole political setup.
And that's exactly what we're digging into today. We've waded through quite a bit of material, including an academic paper, all trying to get a handle on Dr. Mahathir Mohamed's, well, enduring presence in Malaysian politics.
Hmm.
Our mission really is to understand why. Why does this leader who's nearly 100 years old still cast such a long shadow? What are the structural things, the psychological angles, the institutional bits the sources point to?
And, one of the big questions that keeps coming up in the analysis is maybe it's not about whether Malaysia can quit Mahathir, but can Mahathir quit Malaysia?
That's a great way to put it.
Yeah, it seems like he's become so tangled up in the system itself that a clean break is, well, really difficult to imagine according to these analyses.
It's fascinating because he seems to hold so many contradictions, doesn't he?
Oh,
The sources paint this picture of like authoritarian streaks right next to democratic pushes,
right.
overseeing huge development projects, but also maybe contributing to institutions weakening over time. He's portrayed as, well, impossible to just pin down and definitely impossible to ignore.
Definitely. The sources have these labels for him: unsinkable Dr. M. Some even use this really stark phrase, a political vampire, kind of feeding on democracy's lifeblood.
Wow, strong words.
Yeah, I mean, he's had multiple political deaths, hasn't he? Retired, then came back, not once, but twice. And the sources frame this not just as, personal drive, but they link it directly to these deeper weaknesses in Malaysian democracy.
So his staying power isn't just him. The sources see it as a symptom, like a sign that the democracy hasn't fully moved on from its past.
Exactly. It suggests the system hasn't quite shaken off those more authoritarian habits. And that brings us to trying to understand what some sources call the Mahathir phenomenon. And a really key idea here is something called the indispensability paradox.
Okay, the indispensability paradox. Tell me more about that. How does that work according to the sources?
Well, the basic idea is a leader concentrates power, right? And in doing that, they often weaken other institutions, the courts, maybe the civil service, checks and balances.
Mm-hmm.
And eventually things get so centralized that they start to seem like the only person who can actually fix the problems.
Mm.
Problems their own actions might have helped create in the first place.
Ah, I see. So it becomes this self-feeding cycle.
Exactly, a vicious cycle. You make yourself essential, partly by, well, dismantling the alternatives.
That's quite something. And the sources mentioned this shift towards personalized politics. Was that part of it?
Yes, definitely. One academic source we looked at talks about how he really changed the game. It used to be more about bargaining between different groups, sort of power sharing.
Associationalism, they call it.
Right. But he shifted it towards a system where power was much more concentrated, much more controlled by the leader, hegemonic control. His personality, his authority became absolutely central.
And it wasn't just about policy decisions. He actively built this image, didn't he? A leadership mystique. What sorts of qualities did the sources say people attached to him?
Oh, the list is pretty long. People saw him, or he was presented as, visionary, trustworthy, authentic, very pragmatic, resourceful, a good communicator, even ethical and values-driven, according to his supporters. These perceptions helped craft an image that sometimes felt bigger than just his policy record or political moves.
Almost like a brand, a carefully managed brand. I remember the sources talking about narrative construction.
Precisely. The analysis suggests his real genius was branding himself as the, quote, architect of modern Malaysia. Linking himself personally to big things like the Lukis policy, building Putrajaya.
So any criticism felt personal.
It could be framed that way, like an attack not just on him, but on Malaysia's progress, on national pride. And this created this powerful sort of manufactured nostalgia, which, the sources note, becomes especially powerful if later leaders seem to lack that kind of grand vision.
Okay, so it's charisma, but it's also tied to these specific stories he built around himself. But where do the sources say the real deep roots of his influence lie? Structurally, right?
Absolutely. The sources really hammer this point about institutional weakness. The argument goes that Malaysia never quite made a full, solid transition to a robust democracy after independence.
Okay.
Instead, from the 70s onwards, it sort of drifted towards what's called semi-authoritarianism.
Mm.
And this was propped up by things like emergency law still on the books and a political system heavily based on racial lines.
Right.
And that kind of environment, the analysis suggests, just creates space for powerful individuals to dominate and makes real democratic accountability much harder to achieve.
It sounds a bit like that idea of competitive authoritarianism, where you have elections, but the whole playing field is tilted.
That's exactly the kind of system the sources argue Mahathir didn't just navigate, but actually mastered. He used the appearance of democracy elections, parliament, to give his rule legitimacy, while behind the scenes, systematically weakening the checks and balances. Things like the judiciary, the media, stifling opposition.
Yeah.
And a huge factor in all this was his relationship with UMNO.
Right, the United Malays National Organization. That seems really complex. He led them for ages, but then later became one of their biggest critics.
Exactly. And this weirdly flexible position gave him unique leverage. He could slam the corruption within the party he used to lead, often making himself seem somehow above it all, above reproach.
So we could wear different hats?
Totally. Wise elder statesman 1 minute, fiery anti-corruption reformer the next, then maybe defender of Malay nationalism. Whatever suited the political moment.
Which leads us right up to that, well, frankly, astonishing moment in 2018, coming out of retirement, at 92, to lead the opposition against his old party.
It's politically mind-blowing. He essentially managed to rewrite his own past, at least for a while in the public narrative. He crafted this almost messianic story.
Yeah.
That only he could save Malaysia from the massive corruption scandal surrounding Najib Razak, the whole 1MDB affair.
Yeah.
That he was the only one with the stature and, ironically, the ruthlessness to do it.
So he morphed into a democratic savior overnight. Some sources called it maybe the biggest political comeback ever, but there was a huge contradiction baked in, wasn't there?
Oh, absolutely massive. The coalition he led, Pakatan Harapan, they were promising this new Malaysia, real systemic change.
Yeah.
But they were relying on the guy most associated with the old system they wanted to dismantle. The sources argue that fundamental paradox, wanting radical change, but using the ultimate establishment figure, the oldest politician around, basically doomed the whole experiment from the start. It couldn't hold.
It's like that analogy the sources use, the Sheridan syndrome or Dorian Gray. He stays politically young and vital somehow.
While the system ages around him.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
While Malaysian democracy itself maybe shows signs of wear and tear, and each time he comes back, the sources argue, it seems to involve bending or sacrificing some institutional norm for his political needs.
Which connects to that powerful metaphor the sources explore about addiction. Why can't Malaysia quit Mahathir? And it's framed less as just personal attachment and more about the political system having these enablers and dependencies.
Okay, who are the enablers in this picture?
Well, the analysis points a few fingers cautiously. Opposition parties, for example. Sometimes they've enabled his returns by, frankly, failing to build up strong alternative leaders or compelling platforms themselves.
So he fills a vacuum.
Perhaps. Civil society groups, too. In 2018, many understandably backed his anti-corruption push, which gave him a legitimacy boost despite his own history. And then there's the media.
Ah, yes, the media.
I mean, let's be real. Controversy drives clicks and ratings. He's a master of generating headlines. So the media, just by covering him constantly, amplifies his voice and relevance. It's the attention economy.
Right, he knows how to play that game. The sources even talk about a political pandemic of Mahathirism. That's a really striking phrase.
It is, isn't it? And comparing it to COVID-19 really emphasizes how persistent it is, how it keeps flaring up. The sources use it to describe this widespread condition within Malaysian politics, almost like the body politic is, susceptible.
And what are the symptoms of this pandemic?
Things like institutions that seem to instinctively look for a strong man to lead them, political parties that fragment or lose direction without a sort of father figure at the helm, and public discussion that just swings wildly between seeing him as the ultimate hero or the ultimate villain. Very little middle ground.
And central to keeping this pandemic going seems to be what the sources call maybe his biggest failure, the succession issue.
Absolutely a critical point. The analysis strongly suggests that, like a lot of leaders who concentrate power, he systematically, perhaps even deliberately, undermined anyone who looked like a potential successor.
We saw that with Anwar Ibrahim, didn't we?
Yeah.
And others, too.
Exactly. Anwar, Abdullah Badawi, Najib Razak, Muhyiddin Yassin. The list is long. The sources argue this wasn't just about clearing his own path, it actually damaged the system. It left Malaysia without this deep bench of experienced, credible, independent leaders ready to take over.
Making the whole system feel dependent on him rather than on strong institutions.
Precisely. It reinforces that need for the indispensable man.
Now, stepping back a bit, the sources also look at different ways his influence plays out, like beyond just domestic politics. There's the whole international angle, creating a brand Malaysia.
Oh, definitely.
Yeah.
He put Malaysia on the map internationally in a way few others could have, largely through his force of personality. He wasn't shy about speaking out. He became this prominent voice for the developing world, questioning Western dominance, pushing for South-South cooperation, taking very strong stances on issues like Palestine.
And the argument is that this international profile actually helped him back home, gave him political capital.
Yes, that's the connection the sources make, that external validation, being seen as a global player, can kind of substitute for purely domestic democratic legitimacy, especially in a system that leans towards personality politics.
Then there's the generation gap. The sources use that great phrase, the TikTok test. He's on social media, but is his thinking fundamentally, well, analog?
That's the argument.
Yeah.
Yeah, despite having a Twitter account and engaging online, which is remarkable in itself, the analysis suggests his core political thinking is still shaped by older ideas. Cold War kind of binaries, racial hierarchies playing a big role, the state needing to be the main driver of the economy.
Which leads to some really interesting contradictions, doesn't it? You mentioned young people who value progressive ideals voting for this, well, near-centenarian traditionalist.
It's exactly. Or digital activists who hate authoritarianism, celebrating his anti-establishment moves when he was taking on the government. Or even cosmopolitan city dwellers, embracing global culture while supporting a leader often associated with a kind of Malaysian exceptionalism. It's complex.
And his economic legacy, that's another big area the sources wrestle with. He's seen as the father of modern Malaysia's development.
For sure. Huge infrastructure projects, rapid growth for a time. You can't deny that.
Okay.
But the material also argues that the specific model of development he pushed created long-term structural dependencies.
How so?
Well, the emphasis was often on these massive mega projects, on government-linked companies, the GLCs playing a huge role, and on networks of political patronage, sometimes called crony capitalism. It's built stuff, yes, but the sources argue it didn't necessarily build strong, independent economic institutions or foster widespread innovation.
So when people talk about Malaysia being caught in the middle-income trap, the sources see a connection there.
They suggest it reflects the limits of that top-down, state-led, GLC-heavy model. An economy perhaps too reliant on commodities, or foreign investment needing government approval, or government spending itself, rather than, say, dynamic local entrepreneurship really taking off independently. His 2018 return, in this light, could be seen as potentially going back to those familiar patterns.
Another really fascinating point the sources raise is about the opposition's behavior. They use this term, the Stockholm Syndrome effect.
It's provocative, for sure. But the point it's trying to make is quite striking. You had opposition figures who had spent years criticizing Mahathir's authoritarianism, really fighting against him.
Yeah.
And then suddenly in 2018, they not only allied with him, but actively embraced him as their leader. The sources see this as just demonstrating the incredible power of his political brand. It could override decades of political history and animosity.
And what does that say about the opposition itself, according to this analysis?
Well, it suggests some deeper challenges within the opposition. Maybe a struggle to develop their own strong, unifying leaders. Perhaps a tendency to fall into personalized politics, too, rather than focusing on building robust party machinery. And maybe a preference for perceived shortcuts, like riding Mahathir's coattails in 2018 over the slower, harder work of building lasting institutions.
So, tactically smart for that election, maybe?
Perhaps. But the sources frame it as potentially a strategic failure for the opposition's own long-term health and independence. And speaking of contradictions and irony, the timing of that 2024 anti-corruption probe into him and his sons.
Right, given that his whole 2018 comeback was built on an anti-corruption platform against Najib, the irony is thick.
It really underscores that fundamental challenge the sources keep returning to, how incredibly hard it is to achieve truly clean governance in a system where patronage, exchanging political support for contracts, positions, favors, has such deep historical roots.
It highlights that cycle, doesn't it? New leaders campaign against the alleged corruption of the old ones, only to face similar accusations themselves down the line. It suggests the problem isn't just about finding one clean individual.
Exactly. The sources argue it points to the need for systemic reform. It's the system that enables or encourages this behavior, not just the individuals within it.
Okay, let's shift slightly. The sources also delved into the psychological dimension, touching on ideas around narcissism of power.
Yeah, they tread carefully here, but they do suggest that certain personality traits often associated with narcissism, grandiosity, a real need for admiration, maybe a lack of empathy in political dealings, a strong belief in one's own uniqueness and importance, that these traits, while potentially causing problems elsewhere, can actually be advantageous in the rough and tumble world of politics. They can fuel ambition and resilience over decades.
And how might his repeated comebacks fit into that psychological lens?
Well, the sources speculate, linking them partly to what psychologists might call narcissistic injury. Basically, an inability to handle feeling irrelevant, being out of the spotlight, or facing criticism. So from this angle, retirement isn't necessarily a final act.
But more like a strategic pause.
Exactly, a repositioning. Waiting for the moment when the ego needs a boost, or when a crisis allows for a dramatic re-entry onto the stage.
Looking outwards for comparisons, the sources bring up Lee Kuan Yew in Singapore.
Yes, it's a common comparison. Both long-serving leaders, both deeply associated with their nation's development, both cultivating that founding father aura.
Right, where criticism feels almost unpatriotic.
It grants a certain immunity. But the sources emphasize a really crucial difference.
Which is?
Institution building. The argument is that Lee Kuan Yew, for all his dominance, focused on building strong, independent institutions, the civil service, the judiciary, the party that could function effectively after he stepped down.
Whereas Mahathir,
The systems Mahathir built, the analysis contends, remained much more dependent on his personal authority, his networks, his interventions, and you can see the result. Singapore's had relatively smooth leadership transitions. Malaysia keeps facing these succession crises. It starkly shows the difference between institutionalization and personalization.
And finally, there's the role of the media in all this. The sources talk about it almost manufacturing relevance today.
Well, his continued high profile is partly just how the modern media landscape works, isn't it? The attention economy.
Right.
Controversy gets clicks. Polarization drives engagement. And Mahathir is a master generator of both. So, news outlets, social media algorithms, they have built-in incentives to keep covering him.
And his own adaptability is key here, too, being so active online at his age.
It's pretty incredible. Gives him that direct channel to the public, bypassing traditional media gatekeepers, disintermediated democracy.
Yeah.
That digital savvy is a big part of how he stays in the conversation.
So we've looked at all these different threads, the weak institutions, the personalized style, the psychology, the economics, the opposition dynamics, the media. Where does this leave us thinking about the future, about moving beyond Mahathirism?
Well, the sources are pretty clear that even when he's not holding any official position, his influence, his way of thinking, it lingers. Mahathirism, that governing style focused on a strong leader, top-down decisions, development sometimes prioritized over democratic norms, seems quite deeply baked into the political culture.
So the real challenge isn't just moving beyond Mahathir, the person, but moving beyond that style of politics, distinguishing the good bits from the bad.
Exactly. Sorting out the genuinely positive legacies, economic growth, Malaysia's international voice, national confidence from the more problematic ones like weakened institutions, authoritarian tendencies, that reliance on personal power.
And overcoming that, the sources suggest, needs more than just waiting for him to fade away. It requires actively building alternatives.
Yes. Building strong institutional alternatives to that kind of charismatic, personalized authority, strengthening checks and balances, fostering leadership based on merit, not connections, creating accountability systems that actually work, regardless of who is in charge.
So the core takeaway from the sources seems to be that Mahathir's incredible longevity, his ability to keep coming back, it's really a symptom of these deeper unresolved issues within Malaysian democracy itself, a system that perhaps hasn't fully grown up and still looks for that strongman figure.
Yeah, the question, why can't Malaysia quit Mahathir, kind of forces a look at the system's own characteristics. Maybe a historical comfort with strong leaders if they deliver development. maybe a difficulty in building those robust, independent institutions that can function reliably without a dominant figure pulling the strings.
So the real need isn't just to move past Mahathir, but past Mahathirism, that whole model.
That's the argument. And making that shift needs real institutional reform. It needs generational change in leadership, and maybe even a cultural shift. A shift towards valuing institutional strength and democratic accountability, just as much as, or even more than, relying on powerful individuals to deliver results.
And until those deeper changes happen, the sources seem to imply Malaysia might stay stuck in these cycles, hoping the next strong leader will fix everything instead of building the resilient institutions that can manage challenges whoever is in power.
Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe. If, as these sources suggest, Mahathir's enduring presence acts like a mirror reflecting Malaysia's own political journey and struggles, what does that reflection tell us about the challenge any nation faces when it tries to make that fundamental shift? That shift away from politics centered on powerful personalities towards relying on strong, independent, enduring institutions.
Definitely something to think about.